I'm my mom's lawyer." The maid's daughter stood up to the judge, who was laughing at her mother, then shocked him with her legal genius. The courtroom was silent, uncomfortably so. A maid sat at the defendant's table, her uniform neat but her hands trembling. Across from her, a lawyer in a polished suit smirked, certain this would be another easy win. The judge leaned forward, his tone heavy with disdain. "Ms. Ross, you understand you owe $27,000 in medical bills, and you have no legal counsel." She swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor. I couldn't afford one." The chuckle that followed cut deeper than any gavel strike. The humiliation was suffocating. But then, an unexpected voice pierced the silence. "Excuse me, Your Honor," said a girl no older than 11, rising from her chair with a book clutched in her hands. "I would like to be my mother's defender." This is the story of how a maid's daughter stood up in court and changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The girl stood up, a small, steady flame in a cold, silent room. She held a worn library book in her hands and looked the judge right in the eye. What she said next would not just change the course of the hearing, it would change everything. The air in courtroom 3C was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and quiet desperation. It wasn't a grand room. The wood was dark and scuffed. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, tired tune. For Carol Ross, it felt like the smallest, most suffocating room in the world. She sat at the defendant's table, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her work uniform, a simple blue maid's dress, was clean and pressed, but she felt out of place, like a sparrow that had wandered into a den of wolves. Beside her, her daughter, Abigail, sat quietly. At 11 years old, she was a whisper of a girl. She had pale blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her feet, in their simple worn sneakers, did not quite touch the floor. A thick, hardbound book rested on her lap, its cover faded from years of use. She had come straight from school, her backpack still tucked under her chair. Judge Harrison Finch peered down from his perch, his face a mask of bored impatience. He was a man who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. He called the case, his voice a low rumble. Case number 734, Resolute Collections versus Carol Ross. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Carol. "Ms. Ross, you are here today regarding a debt of $27,412. Do you have legal representation?" Carol swallowed hard. The lump in her throat felt like a stone. "No, Your Honor. I couldn't afford a lawyer." A smirk touched the corner of the judge's mouth. It was a small, cruel thing. He glanced at the lawyer from the collection agency, a man in a crisp suit named Mr. Peterson, who looked on with an air of detached confidence. "I see," Judge Finch said, his tone dripping with condescension. He leaned forward, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "And what is your occupation, Ms. Ross?" "I'm a maid, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I clean houses." The judge chuckled. It was not a kind sound. It was sharp and dismissive. "A maid. And you find yourself surprised by a simple matter of unpaid bills? Surely you understand that when you receive a service, you are expected to pay for it. It's not a difficult concept." Humiliation washed over Carol, hot and stinging. Her face flushed a deep red. She felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. The bailiff, the clerk, the handful of strangers in the gallery. They all heard him. They all saw her shame. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain about the hospital, about the endless bills after her husband's accident, about working 3 jobs and still falling behind. But the words wouldn't come. Her mind went blank with panic and embarrassment. All she could do was stare at her hands, her world shrinking to the worn fabric of her uniform. That's when it happened. A small, clear voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me, Your Honor." Judge Finch stopped, his eyebrows raised in annoyance. He looked down and saw the little blonde-haired girl standing beside the defendant's table. Abigail Ross stood straight, her chin up. She was no longer a whisper. She held the thick library book in front of her like a shield. "What is this?" the judge snapped, his irritation clear. "Young lady, this is a court of law, not a school playground. Sit down." "I can't sit down, sir," Abigail said. Her voice did not tremble. It was calm and steady. "You're being unfair to my mom." and I'd like to speak for her." The room went silent. Not a polite, listening silence. It was a stunned, breathless silence. The kind that happens when the world tilts on its axis. Mr. Peterson, the collection agency lawyer, let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Someone in the gallery gasped. Judge Finch stared at the girl, utterly speechless for a moment. He looked from the small, determined girl to her mortified mother. "You want to what? Represent your mother?" He scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. This isn't a movie. Now sit down before I have you removed." "I know I'm not a lawyer," Abigail said, her eyes never leaving his. "But I've read about the law. I've read about what companies like Resolute Collections are allowed to do, and what they are not allowed to do. They broke the rules. Several of them." She held up the book. "It's all in here. And I brought notes." She opened the book. Tucked inside were several pages of notebook paper, covered in neat, careful handwriting. The judge's mocking smile finally vanished. He looked at this 11-year-old girl who spoke of rules and notes, who stood before him without a trace of fear. He saw only purpose in her clear blue eyes. "Approach the bench," he commanded, his voice tight. "Just you." Abigail walked forward, her small sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. She didn't look like a child walking to the principal's office. She looked like a soldier marching to her post. The story of how she got here, however, didn't start with a book or a law. It started with a promise, made in the quiet, dark hours of the night, when the only sound was her mother's silent tears. Carol Ross had never asked for much. She was born and raised in Ohio, in a small town where everyone knew your name. Her father, William Ross, had been a sergeant major in the Army. He was a man of quiet strength and unshakable principles. He taught his children two things. You work hard for what you have, and you always stand up for what is right. Carol lived by those words. She married her high school sweetheart, had Abigail, and built a simple, happy life. She cleaned houses for a living. It was hard, honest work. Her hands were often chapped and sore. Her back ached at the end of the day, but she took pride in it. She was good at what she did. She left every home sparkling, a little brighter than when she found it. She was proud that she could provide for her family. Proud that Abigail never went without, that she had food on the table, good books to read, and a warm, safe home. Then, 3 years ago, that safe world had been shattered. Her husband, Mark, was in a terrible car accident on his way home from his construction job. He survived, but he was never the same. The injuries left him unable to work, in constant pain. The medical bills began to arrive like a relentless flood. First, it was a few thousand, then 10,000, then 20. Soon, they were drowning in a sea of paper. White envelopes that brought with them a fresh wave of panic and fear. Carol took on more work. She started cleaning offices in the evening after her day of house cleaning was done. She took a weekend job at a diner, waitressing until the early hours of the morning. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that sleep could not fix. But she kept going. For Mark. For Abigail. Mark couldn't bear seeing her work herself to the bone. The guilt and the pain were too much for him. One cold winter morning, a year after the accident, he passed away in his sleep. The doctor said his heart just gave out. Carol knew he had died of a broken spirit. Now it was just her and Abigail. The mountain of debt remained, a monument to their grief. That's when the phone call started. Men with smooth, cold voices from a company called Resolute Collections. They called in the morning. They called at night. They called her at work. They were polite at first, then demanding, then cruel. They threatened to take her home, to ruin her credit, to take everything she had left. Carol tried to explain. She tried to set up a payment plan. She sent them what little she could, $20 here, $50 there. But it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The fees and interest they added made the debt grow larger, not smaller. She kept a folder of every bill, every letter, every notice. It was thick and heavy, the weight of her impossible situation. Abigail saw it all. She was a quiet, watchful child. She saw the worry etched on her mother's face. She saw her mother at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by bills, her head in her hands. She heard the hushed, frantic phone calls. She saw the fear in her mother's eyes, a fear she tried so hard to hide. Kids know more than we think. They feel more than we let on. Abigail didn't cry or ask questions that would add to her mother's burden. Instead, she started to act. She started with the one thing she knew how to do better than anyone else her age. She started to read. She began at the local library. She would finish her homework, then slip away to the nonfiction section. She started by looking up words she heard her mom say on the phone. Words like garnishment, lien, and statute of limitations. She checked out books. Simple ones at first, about managing money. Then, she found the legal section. It was dusty and overlooked, filled with thick, imposing books that nobody seemed to read. But Abigail wasn't intimidated. She pulled a book from the shelf, its title plain and direct, The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, a guide for consumers. She sat at a small wooden table in the corner of the library and began to read. The language was complicated, filled with terms she didn't understand. So she kept a small notebook, writing down the words she didn't know and looking them up one by one. She learned that debt collectors weren't allowed to call you at certain hours. They weren't allowed to harass you or lie to you. They weren't allowed to threaten you with actions they couldn't legally take. With every page she turned, a quiet anger began to build inside her. These people, these voices on the phone, they were breaking the rules. They were bullying her mother, and they thought they could get away with it. Her grandfather, Sergeant Major William Ross, had passed away before she was born, but his presence was still strong in their house. His portrait hung in the living room, a handsome man in his dress uniform, his eyes kind but firm. Carol told Abigail stories about him. He was a man who believed in order, in rules, in fairness. He believed that the law was there to protect the weak from the strong. He always said that bullies only have power if you let them, Carol would tell her. You have to stand your ground. One day, while looking for a photo album in the attic, Abigail found an old footlocker. It was her grandfather's. Inside, beneath his folded uniform, were his books. They weren't storybooks. They were books on military history, on strategy, and, at the very bottom, a worn, leather-bound copy of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. She took the book down to her room. She didn't understand most of it, but she understood the spirit behind it. It was about rights. It was about procedure. It was about holding people accountable for their actions. It was about justice. She read it every night, a flashlight under her blanket, soaking in the principles her grandfather had lived by. The night the court summons arrived, Carol finally broke. Abigail found her in the kitchen, slumped over the table, the official-looking document in her hand, silent tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to do, Abby, she whispered. I don't know what to do. Abigail put her arms around her mother. It's going to be okay, Mom, she said, her voice full of a certainty she didn't feel but desperately wanted her mother to believe. Grandpa always said you have to face a bully head-on. That night, Abigail didn't sleep. She sat at her small desk with her library book, her grandfather's military justice code, and a fresh notebook. She took out her mother's thick folder of bills and letters from Resolute Collections. For hours, she worked. She compared the letters to the rules in the book. She made a list. Violation 1. Calling before 8 a.m. and after 9 p.m. She found phone records her mom had circled showing calls at 6:30 in the morning. Violation 2. Using harassing language. She remembered her mom writing down the exact words an agent had used. You're a disgrace. We'll make sure you lose everything. Violation 3. Misrepresenting the amount of the debt. She cross-referenced the original hospital bills with the collection agency's statements. They had added thousands of dollars in administrative fees, with no explanation. She wrote everything down, making a clear, logical timeline. She made notes in the margins, citing specific sections of the law she had memorized. She wasn't just a sad little girl anymore. She was a soldier preparing her battlefield. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. She didn't tell her mom what she was doing. She didn't want to give her false hope. She just kept working, her small desk lamp a beacon of light in the dark, quiet house. When the sun came up, she had a plan. The morning of the court hearing, she dressed in her school clothes. She packed her backpack, and she slipped her notes inside the old library book. When her mother said she had to go to the courthouse, Abigail said calmly, I'm coming with you. Carol was too exhausted and worried to argue. She just nodded, grateful not to be alone. They sat in the courtroom, her mother trembling beside her. Abigail felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She looked at the judge, at the smug lawyer. They didn't see her. They just saw a maid and her little girl. They had already decided who her mother was. They had already decided they had won. Abigail knew better. She remembered her grandfather's picture. She remembered his words, passed down through her mother. You stand your ground. And so, when the judge humiliated her mother, when he laughed at her, when he tried to make her feel small and worthless, Abigail stood up. She stood her ground. Now she stood before the judge's bench, the whole courtroom watching. He loomed over her, a figure of immense power. But Abigail wasn't looking at his black robe or the gavel in his hand. She was looking him in the eye. You understand this is a real legal proceeding, correct? Judge Finch asked, his voice low and stern, meant to intimidate. This isn't a book report. Your mother could lose her home. Yes, sir. I understand that very well, Abigail replied. That's why I'm here. My mother, Carol Ross, is a good person. She works harder than anyone I know. She doesn't owe this company what they say she owes. And they have treated her illegally. Illegally? The judge's voice held a note of disbelief. Those are strong words for a, what grade are you in? Fifth. Sixth grade, Your Honor, Abigail said. And yes, illegally. According to the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, which is a federal law, a debt collector cannot harass, oppress, or abuse any person in connection with the collection of a debt. The representatives from Resolute Collections called my mother at all hours of the day and night. They insulted her. They threatened her. She has records. Judge Finch was silent for a long moment. He looked over at Mr. Peterson, who was starting to look less confident. He looked at Carol, who was staring at her daughter with a mixture of terror and awe. Then he looked back at the small girl in front of him. You have a lot to say for someone your age, the judge said, his tone shifting slightly. The mockery was gone, replaced by a flicker of something else. Curiosity. All right, Miss Ross. The court is listening. Go back to the table and proceed. Let's hear what you have to say. Abigail gave a small, respectful nod. She turned and walked back to the table. She stood beside her mother, placed the open book on the table, and took a deep breath. She felt her mother's hand find hers under the table, gripping it tightly. My name is Abigail Ross, she began, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent courtroom. And I am here to speak for my mom. She did not stumble. She did not hesitate. She began by laying out the facts, one by one, with the simple, devastating logic of the truth. She was no longer just a maid's daughter. She was a force to be reckoned with. And everyone in that room, from the bored bailiff to the powerful judge, was about to find out just how much of a force she could be. Abigail kept her hand on the worn cover of the library book, grounding herself. The other hand held her notes, the pages filled with her steady, determined script. She didn't look at the judge or the opposing lawyer. She looked at a point on the back wall, just as she'd practiced in her bedroom, pretending she was speaking to her grandfather's portrait. The debt began after my father, Mark Ross, had a car accident on May 12th, 3 years ago, she stated. The total for his hospital stay at St. Jude's Medical Center was $19,800. My mother has the original bill. She paused, and Carol, her hands shaking slightly, pushed a piece of paper across the table. After my father passed away, my mother did her best to make payments. But Resolute Collections bought the debt. She looked down at her notes. The first call from them was on August 2nd of last year. They claimed the amount owed was $22,000. They had already added over $2,000 in fees. The law, specifically Section 1692F of the FDCPA, states that a debt collector may not collect any amount, including any interest, fee, charge, or expense incidental to the principal obligation, unless such amount is expressly authorized by the agreement creating the debt or permitted by law. Mr. Peterson, the lawyer for the collection agency, stood up abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. Is the court really going to entertain legal analysis from a child? Judge Finch held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes were fixed on Abigail, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. She is presenting a sequence of events, Mr. Peterson. I will allow it. Please continue, Miss Ross. Abigail nodded, unfazed. Thank you, Your Honor. My mother asked for a validation of the debt in writing, which is her right under Section 1692G. They never sent her a full accounting of these fees. They just sent letters with a bigger number each time. The current amount they are demanding, $27,412, includes over $7,000 in unexplained charges. She flipped a page in her notes. The harassment started in September. An agent named Mr. Jones called my mother at her evening job. Her boss had to ask her not to take personal calls. This is a violation of Section 1692C, which says a debt collector cannot contact a consumer at their place of employment if they know the employer prohibits such calls. My mother had told them this on a previous call. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The quiet shuffling and coughing from the gallery had stopped. Everyone was leaning forward, listening. Carol sat beside her daughter, her fear slowly being replaced by a fierce, burning pride. She was seeing a part of her daughter she never knew existed. A strength, a fire, that reminded her so much of her own father. On October 15th, Abigail continued, her voice steady. My mother missed a call from them because she was at a parent-teacher conference for me. They then called our neighbor, Mrs. Gavel, and told her that my mom was in serious financial trouble and that they were going to sue her. This is a direct violation of Section 1692B, which strictly limits third-party contact. They are not allowed to reveal the nature of their business or the consumer's debt to anyone else. She took a breath and finally looked directly at Mr. Peterson. But the worst part was the threats. On December 1st, an agent told my mother, and she wrote it down right after the call, that if she didn't pay $5,000 by the end of the week, they would have a warrant issued for her arrest. Your Honor, she said, turning her gaze to the judge, that is not only a lie. It is an illegal threat under Section 1692E. You cannot be arrested for a civil debt in this state. They knew that. They were trying to scare her. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Judge Finch's face. It was anger, not at the little girl lecturing him on the law, but at the facts she was presenting. He looked down at the file in front of him, at the simple lawsuit filed by Resolute Collections. It looked so straightforward on paper. A debtor, a creditor, a sum of money. But the story this child was telling painted a much darker picture. A story of predatory behavior, of a powerful company bullying a grieving widow. Mr. Peterson, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you have any response to these specific allegations? Mr. Peterson was on his feet, his face flushed. Your Honor, these are baseless accusations. My client operates within the full scope of the law. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt by the defendant to avoid her obligations. She has a child reciting a story she likely coached her to tell. Before the judge could respond, Abigail spoke again, her voice ringing with indignation. My mother didn't coach me. I learned this myself because I was tired of seeing her cry. I was tired of her being scared of the phone ringing. And I have proof. She walked forward and placed her mother's thick folder on the bailiff's desk. And here are my mother's phone records, with the calls from Resolute circled. There are dated notes she took after every conversation, writing down what they said. There is a signed letter from her boss confirming she was told not to receive calls at work. And there is a statement from our neighbor, Mrs. Gavel, about the call she received. She looked back at the judge. My mother is a maid. She spends her days cleaning up other people's messes. She is the most honest person I know. She deserved to be treated with respect, not to be harassed and lied to. She paused, her small shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. My grandfather was Sergeant Major William Ross. He fought in 2 wars for this country. He believed in rules, and he believed in justice. He taught my mom that you should never let a bully win just because they are bigger than you. Resolute Collections is a bully, and they broke the law. The name dropped into the silent courtroom like a stone into a still pond. Sergeant Major William Ross. Judge Finch went still. His eyes widened slightly. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked on Abigail, but it seemed as if he was looking at something far away in another time. The name was familiar. More than familiar. He knew that name. The judge slowly swiveled his chair to the side, looking at the American flag that stood in the corner of the courtroom. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. The whole room held its breath, waiting. Mr. Peterson stood awkwardly, his objection forgotten. Carol looked from the judge to her daughter, a confused hope dawning on her face. Finally, Judge Finch turned back. He looked at Abigail, and his expression had completely changed. The hardness was gone. The impatience was gone. In their place was a look of profound, solemn respect. Sergeant Major William Ross, the judge repeated, his voice now soft, almost reverent. I knew him. Not personally, but I know who he was. His name is on a plaque in the lobby of this very courthouse. A hero of this city. He looked at Carol. He was your father? Carol nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked back at Abigail, who stood her ground, waiting. He saw her now not as a little girl playing lawyer, but as the legacy of a man he deeply respected. He saw the same steel, the same unwavering belief in right and wrong. He cleared his throat and sat up straight. All business once more, but his tone was forever changed. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice now sharp as steel, "I am going to call a brief recess. When we return, I expect you to have your client on the phone, and you had better have answers to every single one of the allegations Miss Ross has just raised. And I assure you, they had better be good ones." He struck the gavel once, the sound echoing like a gunshot. 30-minute recess. As he stood to leave, he paused and looked down at Abigail. "Young lady," he said, his voice quiet, filled with a respect that stunned the room. "Your grandfather would be very, very proud of you." The 30-minute recess felt like a lifetime. The moment Judge Finch left the bench, the low murmur of the gallery erupted into a buzz of hushed, excited chatter. People turned in their seats, whispering and pointing toward the small girl with the blonde ponytail who now sat beside her mother. Abigail, for her part, seemed oblivious to the attention. She was methodically putting her papers back into her folder, her small face a mask of concentration. Carol, however, felt as if she were floating. She stared at her daughter, this child she had raised, this person she thought she knew completely, and saw a stranger. A brilliant, fierce, and utterly terrifying stranger. Where had this come from? The books, of course, she had seen Abigail reading. But to stand up in a federal courtroom, to quote laws, to face down a judge and a lawyer without flinching? It was beyond anything she could have imagined. She finally found her voice, a choked whisper. "Abby, how did you know all that? How did you know about Grandpa?" Abigail looked up from her papers, her expression softening as she saw the tears in her mother's eyes. "I've been going to the library, Mom. I read about it, and I found Grandpa's old books in the attic. The ones about military law. He wrote notes in the margins. About fairness. About standing up to people who misuse their power." She reached out and took her mother's hand. It was cold and trembling. "They were bullying you. I couldn't let them. But the judge, he said he knew him. His name is on a plaque in the lobby," Abigail said simply. "I saw it when we came in. In memory of the city's finest, Sergeant Major William Ross. I was hoping the judge would know the name, that he would know what kind of man Grandpa was, that he would know that his daughter and his granddaughter wouldn't be liars." Carol squeezed her daughter's hand, a wave of love so powerful it almost took her breath away, washing over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope, a fragile, flickering flame that she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Mark's death, she felt like she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Across the courtroom, Mr. Peterson was on his phone, his back to the room. His confident, smug demeanor was gone, replaced by a frantic, panicked energy. His voice was a low, angry hiss. "What do you mean you don't know? Check the call logs. I don't care about procedure. I have a judge who looks like he's about to throw the entire case out because a sixth grader quoted the FDCPA at him. Yes, a sixth grader. Just get me the information. Now." He slammed the phone down, his face pale with a mixture of fury and dread. He looked over at Abigail, and for the first time, he saw her not as a child, but as the architect of his impending disaster. The bailiff called the court back to order. "All rise." Judge Finch swept back into the room, his face grim and determined. He sat down and wasted no time. "Mr. Peterson, is your client on the line?" "Yes, Your Honor," Peterson said, his voice strained. He motioned to his cell phone, which was on speaker. "I have Mr. Reynolds, the head of operations for Resolute Collections." "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, his voice booming through the small speaker. "This is Judge Harrison Finch. Are you aware of the allegations of harassment and illegal collection practices being made against your company in my courtroom today?" A tinny, defensive voice came through the phone. "Your Honor, we operate in full compliance with—" "Save it," the judge cut him off. "I have here a detailed list of violations, with dates, names, and specific actions that appear to directly contravene federal law. Let's start with the first one. A phone call made to the defendant's neighbor, in which your agent discussed the details of Ms. Ross's debt. Is that, or is that not, a standard practice at your company?" There was a pause on the line. Mr. Peterson was staring at the floor, looking as if he wished it would swallow him whole. Your Honor, the voice on the phone finally said, sometimes in an effort to locate a debtor, our agents may. That is not what I asked, Mr. Reynolds. The judge thundered. I asked if it was standard practice to violate the FDCPA. Yes or no? No, Your Honor. Then can you explain why it happened in this case? Another pause. I would have to review the agent's file. How about the threats of arrest? The judge continued, his voice relentless. Are your agents trained to lie to debtors, to threaten them with legal consequences that do not exist, in order to frighten them into paying? Absolutely not, Your Honor. That would be grounds for immediate termination. And yet, Judge Finch said, leaning forward, that is precisely what Ms. Ross's daughter claims happened. And she has presented a compelling, meticulously documented case to this court. A case, I might add, that is more thorough and more convincing than many I have seen from lawyers with decades of experience. He looked over at Abigail, a flicker of a smile touching his lips before he turned his glare back to the lawyer. Your Honor, if I may, Mr. Peterson interjected, finding a sliver of courage. Even if, and I stress, if, some procedural errors were made by an overzealous agent, the underlying debt remains. Ms. Ross did receive the medical services. The debt is valid. Is it? The judge asked, raising an eyebrow. Miss Ross, he said, turning his attention to Abigail. You mentioned discrepancies in the amount owed. Can you elaborate? Abigail stood up, her notes in hand. Yes, Your Honor. The original debt was $19,800. Resolute Collections is suing for $27,412. That's a difference of $7,612. They call them administrative and legal fees. But under the law, they have to be able to explain exactly what those fees are for. They never have. She walked to the bailiff and handed him another paper from her folder. This is a copy of the original agreement my parents signed with the hospital. It says that in the event of collection, reasonable costs may be added. But the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has issued rulings on what is reasonable. Adding nearly 40% to the original debt is not reasonable. It's called fee padding, and it's another violation. Judge Finch took the paper and examined it. He looked up at Mr. Peterson. Well, counselor, is a 40% fee reasonable? Mr. Peterson was speechless. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely and utterly outmaneuvered. He had come to court for a simple default judgment, a slam dunk against a defendant with no lawyer. He had walked into an ambush, led by a child with a library book. The judge turned his attention back to the phone. Mr. Reynolds, it seems to me that your company has not only engaged in a pattern of illegal harassment, but is also attempting to collect a debt that is inflated by potentially fraudulent fees. This court takes such matters very seriously. In fact, under the FDCPA, each violation can result in statutory damages of up to $1,000, plus actual damages and attorney's fees. Attorney's fees? Mr. Peterson blurted out. She doesn't have an attorney. The judge leveled a cold stare at him. Mr. Peterson, given the circumstances, I am very close to finding you and your client in contempt of this court. I would advise you to remain silent. He looked back at Carol and Abigail. But he does raise an interesting point. The law is designed to make the wronged party whole. He paused, thinking for a moment. Miss Ross, he said to Abigail, what would you and your mother consider a just resolution to this matter? The question hung in the air. The power in the room had shifted completely. It no longer resided on the judge's bench or with the lawyer in the expensive suit. It rested with the 11-year-old girl in the worn sneakers. Abigail hadn't prepared for this. Her goal was to stop them from taking their home, to expose the lies. She hadn't thought about what came next. She looked at her mother. Carol's face was filled with a mix of emotions, but the strongest one was trust. She trusted her daughter. Abigail took a breath and faced the judge. Justice, Your Honor? She asked, her voice clear and steady. Justice would be for them to stop harassing my mom. Justice would be for them to correct the amount of the debt to what it actually is. And she hesitated for a second, then a new kind of resolve hardened her expression. And justice would be for them to pay for the fear and the sleepless nights they caused my mother. The law says they broke the rules. Breaking the rules should have consequences. Judge Finch listened, nodding slowly. He had seen this kind of clarity before, this simple, unshakable sense of right and wrong. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers. He saw it now in the eyes of a soldier's granddaughter. "I agree," he said. He looked at Mr. Peterson, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "Here is what is going to happen. I am dismissing this case, with prejudice. That means you cannot file it again. Ever." A collective gasp went through the gallery. Carol grabbed Abigail's arm, her knuckles white. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice a hammer striking steel, "I am going to open a formal investigation into the practices of resolute collections, based on the evidence presented in this courtroom today. I will be referring this matter to the State Attorney General and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau." The tinny voice on the phone squawked in protest, but the judge ignored it. "As for the matter of damages, since Ms. Ross does not have an attorney, we will calculate them differently. We have multiple, clear violations of federal law. We have the infliction of severe emotional distress. And we have an attempt to collect a fraudulent debt." He scribbled on his notepad. "This court hereby orders resolute collections to do the following. First, the entire debt of Carol Ross is canceled. She owes you nothing." Carol let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for years finally broke free, streaming down her face. "Second," the judge said, his voice ringing with authority, "you will pay a penalty to Ms. Ross for the harassment and illegal practices. We will calculate it based on the $7,612 in fraudulent fees you attempted to collect. I am ordering you to pay Ms. Ross that exact amount, as punitive damages." He looked directly at Abigail. "And finally, for the time and effort this young lady has put into doing the job that lawyers are paid to do, for the brilliant and courageous defense she mounted on behalf of her mother, this court is ordering an additional payment to be made. A consulting fee, if you will. I believe a fee of $500 per violation cited is appropriate. You cited for specific violations, Miss Ross." Abigail, stunned, could only nod. "So that will be an additional $2,000, the judge declared, to be put into a college fund for Miss Abigail Ross." He looked at Mr. Peterson one last time. "You have 30 days to make these payments. Do you understand?" "Why, yes, Your Honor," Peterson stammered. "This court is adjourned," Judge Finch said, and with a final, booming crack of the gavel, it was over. The room exploded into noise. People in the gallery were on their feet, applauding. Reporters who had been half asleep in the back row were now scrambling for the door, dialing their news desks. This was a story, a huge story, but Carol and Abigail didn't notice. They were wrapped in each other's arms, holding on tight. The weight of years of fear and struggle was gone, lifted in an instant. Carol was sobbing into her daughter's hair, repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over again. Abigail held her mother, her own eyes wet with tears. She had done it. She had faced the bully. She had stood her ground. And she had won. As they were getting ready to leave, the bailiff approached them. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said to Carol. "The judge would like to see you and your daughter in his chambers." Nervously, they followed him through a side door into the judge's private office. It was a large room, lined with law books from floor to ceiling. Judge Finch was standing by the window, his black robe off, looking out over the city. He turned as they entered, and he was smiling. A real, warm smile. "Please, come in," he said. "I won't keep you long. I just wanted to say something in private." He walked over to his desk and picked up a framed photograph. He brought it over to them. It was a picture of a much younger Judge Finch than a young lieutenant in the Army, standing next to another soldier. A tall, proud man with kind eyes and the chevrons of a sergeant major on his sleeve. "This was taken a long time ago," the judge said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a brand new officer, scared out of my mind. Your father, your grandfather, he was my sergeant major. He looked after me. He taught me what it meant to be a leader. He taught me about honor and about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is." He looked at Carol. "He was the finest man I ever knew. I am so sorry for your loss. And I am so sorry that you were treated this way. Our system should have protected you. It shouldn't have taken your daughter to make it right." Then, he knelt down, so he was eye to eye with Abigail. "You," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You have his spirit, that same fire, that same sense of justice. You did something extraordinary today. You reminded me of why I became a judge in the first place." He reached into his desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. "I want you to have this," he said, handing it to her. It was a copy of the Constitution of the United States. You read it, you learn it, and you never, ever let anyone tell you that you can't make a difference. Abigail took the book, its weight feeling important and real in her hands. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. "No," the judge said, standing up. "Thank you." They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. The world felt different, lighter. For the first time in a long time, Carol Ross wasn't thinking about bills or debts or threatening phone calls. She was thinking about the future. As they reached the sidewalk, they were suddenly surrounded by reporters, microphones and cameras thrust in their faces. "Miss Ross, how does it feel? What are you going to do with the money? Abigail, can you give us a comment?" Abigail, overwhelmed, shrank back behind her mother. Carol, seeing her daughter's distress, felt a surge of her old protective fire. She put her arm around Abigail and faced the cameras. Her voice, once a timid whisper in the courtroom, was now strong and clear. "My daughter and I just want to go home," she said. "But I will say this. My daughter is the bravest person I know, and I want everyone out there who is scared and feels like they are alone to know that you should never give up. You have to stand your ground." With that, she guided Abigail through the crowd, and they walked down the street, hand in hand, leaving the chaos behind them. They didn't look back. They were heading home, to a future that was suddenly, miraculously, their own. The walk home was surreal. The city sounds, the rush of traffic, the chatter of people passing by on the sidewalk, it all seemed distant, like a movie playing with the sound turned down. Carol and Abigail walked in a comfortable silence, their hands still clasped tightly together. The weight of the world had been on Carol's shoulders for so long, and now, with it gone, she felt almost dizzy with lightness. When they reached their small apartment building, the first thing Carol noticed was how different it looked. It was the same worn brick building it had always been, the same slightly crooked steps leading to the front door. But for the first time in years, she wasn't looking at it with a knot of fear in her stomach, wondering how long it would be hers. She was looking at a home, a safe place, theirs. Inside, the little apartment was quiet. They took off their shoes, and Abigail put her backpack down by the door. The thick, leather-bound Constitution the judge had given her felt heavy and important. She placed it carefully on the small table in the entryway, next to the framed picture of her grandfather. The two objects seemed to belong together. Carol went into the kitchen and put the kettle on, her movements automatic. She looked around the small, clean room. She saw the chipped paint on the windowsill, the faint water stain on the ceiling, the old, mismatched chairs around the table. Before, these were all signs of her struggle, imperfections she didn't have the time or money to fix. Now they just looked like home. She leaned against the counter and finally let herself fully believe it was over. The debt was gone. The harassing calls would stop. They were safe. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped her, a sound that carried 3 years of anxiety and exhaustion with it. Abigail came into the kitchen and stood beside her. "Are you okay, Mom?" Carol turned and pulled her daughter into another hug, this one softer, quieter. She buried her face in Abigail's soft, blonde hair. "I'm more than okay, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm free. You made me free." They stood like that for a long moment, the only sound the low whistle of the kettle starting to boil. The news story broke that evening. It was the lead segment on the local 6 o'clock news. A dramatic headline flashed across the screen. 11-year-old legal prodigy takes on predatory debt collector and wins. There was shaky footage from outside the courthouse, showing Carol and Abigail leaving, their faces grim and determined. There was an interview with a legal expert who talked with awe about the girls' command of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. They even showed a picture of Sergeant Major William Ross, pulled from the city archives, calling Abigail a true heir to a local hero's legacy. Their phone began to ring. It wasn't the cold, threatening voice of a bill collector. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Gable, crying with joy. It was Carol's boss from the diner, telling her how proud he was. It was friends and distant relatives they hadn't heard from in years, all calling to offer congratulations and support. The story went viral overnight. It was picked up by national news outlets, then international ones. The tale of the maid's daughter who stood up to a judge and shocked him with her legal genius was irresistible. It was a David and Goliath story for the modern age. For Carol and Abigail, the sudden fame was overwhelming. People recognized them on the street. A local car dealership offered Carol a reliable used car, free of charge, so she wouldn't have to take the bus to her cleaning jobs. The mail carriers started bringing bags of letters to their door. Some contained small checks, $5, $10, $20, from strangers who had been moved by their story. Others were just letters of support from people all over the country who had their own stories of fighting against faceless, powerful companies. They wrote about feeling helpless and alone, and how Abigail's courage had given them a spark of hope. Abigail read every single letter. She saw that their story wasn't just their story. It was the story of millions of people caught in a system that was designed to grind them down. They weren't just a maid and her daughter anymore. They had become a symbol. A few weeks later, a long, official-looking envelope arrived. It was from the office of the state attorney general. Inside was a letter informing Carol that, based on the investigation launched by Judge Finch, the state was filing a massive lawsuit against Resolute Collections for deceptive and illegal practices. The evidence Abigail had compiled was the cornerstone of their case. The letter ended with a handwritten note from the Attorney General himself. Ms. Ross, your daughter has done a great service not just for your family, but for every citizen of this state. Thank you. The money from the court order arrived, too. A check for $9,612. Carol held it in her hands, staring at the number. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place. It was enough to pay off the last of the lingering medical bills. It was enough to fix the leaky faucet. It was enough to buy Abigail a new winter coat. It was enough to breathe. The $2,000 for Abigail's college fund was sent directly to a state-managed account, where it would sit and grow, a seed of a future that had once seemed impossible. Life began to settle into a new kind of normal, a better normal. Carol still cleaned houses, but she was able to cut back on her hours. She quit her weekend job at the diner. She had evenings free to help Abigail with her homework, to watch movies together, to just sit and talk. The worry lines around her eyes began to soften. She started to smile again, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Abigail went back to being a sixth grader. She did her homework. She read her library books. She met her friends at the park. But something inside her had changed. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She had looked into the heart of the adult world, with all its complicated, unfair rules, and she hadn't backed down. She knew, in a way that most people never learn, what she was capable of. One afternoon, a few months after the court case, Abigail was in the living room, doing her homework. Carol was dusting, humming softly to herself. She paused at the little table by the door. She picked up the thick book on the Constitution that Judge Finch had given Abigail. She ran her hand over the embossed gold lettering. You know, Carol said thoughtfully, I think your grandpa would have really liked Judge Finch. Abigail looked up from her math problems. I think so too, she said. He always believed the system could work, Carol continued, more to herself than to Abigail. That if you had good people, honorable people, in charge, then justice was possible. I guess I'd forgotten that. She looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with love. You reminded me. That evening, as Abigail was getting ready for bed, she stood for a moment in front of the picture of her grandfather. She looked at his kind, firm eyes. In her head, she had a little conversation with him, something she had started doing ever since the trial. I did it, Grandpa, she thought. I stood my ground. She felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew he would be proud. She hadn't just won a court case. She had honored his memory. She had carried his legacy forward. The story of Abigail Ross, the 11-year-old lawyer, eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories, new outrages, new heroes. But for the people who had been touched by it, it was never forgotten. For Judge Harrison Finch, it was a reminder of the oath he took and the man who had inspired him to take it. For the countless people buried under mountains of debt, it was a flicker of hope, a story they told each other to keep their spirits up. And for a mother and a daughter in a small apartment in Ohio, it was the story of how their lives changed forever. It wasn't about the money, or the fame, or even the victory in court. It was about the moment a little girl stood up in a cold, intimidating room, looked a powerful man in the eye, and spoke the truth. It was about the moment she stopped being a victim of her circumstances and became the master of her own fate. It was the moment she showed the world that courage doesn't have an age limit, that justice is worth fighting for, and that sometimes The most powerful weapon you have is a library book, a clear voice, and the unwavering belief that you are standing on the side of right. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.